Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this GC Sustainability Forum. We're very pleased to partner with Legal 500 to present this forum, this conversation with a range of experts looking at the context of net zero, what to expect from your investors and lenders. I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Michael Watson. I'm the head of climate and sustainability at the global law firm Pinson Masons. And we're very pleased, as I say, to partner with Legal 500 in this forum. It's the first in a series of GC Sustainability Forum. There's a pop-up on your window which you can opt in to receive information about future fora during the course of this calendar year. If you find this one useful, please do opt in and attend future events. Never has the topic been more important, I think, than now, as I'm sure we're all acutely aware, the important role that general counsel and in-house lawyers play in the context of net zero spans organisations, but in particular following COP26 and the accelerating pace of change that we're all experiencing, the role of investors and lenders in interacting with businesses and corporates has never been more critical, more important. I'm very, very pleased indeed to be joined by an expert and experienced panel today, and I'll briefly introduce them and you'll learn more about them as we go through our conversation and dialogue. As I say, I'm head of climate and sustainability at Pinson Masons with a background in project finance and energy finance over the last 30 years, so I hope I can bring my insights to bear too. But we are very, very pleased to welcome our panelists today. First up, we've got Allison Collins. Allison is head of ESG at Pollen Street Capital, having joined them in 2018, and is responsible for running the ESG program across the whole portfolio of investments that and role that Pollen Street Capital have. Secondly, we've got Steve Jennings. Steve is head of energy and head of sustainable business division for EMEA at the global bank MUFG, and responsible for running the program, that program across the EMEA region, leads a team that is responsible for power and renewables and natural resources lending, and also this team provides financial advisory services too across the sector. And last but not least, we've got Richard Manley. Richard, welcome. Richard is the Managing Director and Head of Sustainable Investing at CPPI, the global investment house, and he leads the team responsible for integrating consideration of ESG factors and climate risks and opportunities across the significant investment program that CPPI have. So I'm sure you'll agree with me that's a really excellent panel, bringing together insights from the lending community, public markets, private markets of a global scale, and also at a local scale as well. So I hope we can bring insights to you all. And that's really the key objective of today. As general counsel and in-house lawyers, we would like you to leave here with some actionable insights, things that you can or should do in connection with advising your boards, advising your stakeholders on these matters. And I think that word "should" is really important as well. We'll touch on that quite a lot as we get through the conversation. The role of a general counsel very often is to support a corporate as to what can it do within the remit, within the realms and strictures of legislation and regulation. Critically, in this area, I would argue that the role extends much more broadly than that, to be one to advise the corporate what should it be doing in the context of what we know now, but also what we see in the future, and often at an accelerating pace in the context of ESG. As I say, post COP26, we really did see an acceleration and a highlighting of the role of the finance community and a collaboration across the finance community in bringing ESG to the fore and focusing on their investee companies and borrowers to ensure this happens. We'll cover 4 topics today. Very quickly, those topics are going to be what do lenders and investors expect of a board and a corporate? What do they expect in terms of targets and requirements? Secondly, looking at the impact that the ESG agenda has on the availability of finance and indeed the cost of finance to businesses. Thirdly, what does a transition plan need to look like? What are the key components of a transition plan that investors and lenders would look for? And finally, what data can you obtain and how does one measure progress having regard to the range of options available and the quality of data available. All of these topics hopefully will feed together, as I say, into a conclusion where we have some actionable insights for you, and we'll look to close promptly on the hour. As we go through the webinar, there's a Q&A function. Please do feel free to type your questions into the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to those questions either during the topics or leave some time at the end for questions as well. So thank you very much, and without further ado, I'll turn to our first panelist and the first topic, Alison, which is the expectation that you have in Pollen Street of your investee companies and of the boards of them. You're an investor focused on transformation. What levers and approaches do you employ with your investee businesses to ensure that ESG factors are properly aligned and properly embedded in those businesses?
Thanks, Michael, and hi, everybody. So at Pollen Street, we've got both private equity and credit strategies. And we use our ownership to apply a sustainability lens as well as amplifying ESG impact. It's very important that obviously we reduce risk and we have the highest levels of governance, both for us as a firm, our portfolio, and also our investors. So within PE, we generally take a controlling stake in the portfolio companies, which are of different sizes and maturities, and more often than not private. We usually have at least one of our deal team, senior deal team, on the boards of the portfolio companies, so we can play a leading role and sort of have significant influence. So with the board, some of the things that we work on are, very much setting the expectations and a vision for ESG. The company doesn't have to be perfect from the get-go, as many of them are quite small, but they have to have the appetite and ability to allocate resource to address ESG matters. The other area is thinking about, it is very much sort of the helping hand, active management and engagement with practical ideas and frameworks for ESG practice and for impact. Sustainability, as we all know, is not now a side project and should be closely linked to the strategy and culture of the business, which the board should lead. The other area that is very much a focus is the education piece on ESG trends and also the regulatory moves, which is very much an area where our, the legal team and the GCs can help. And another area, within Pollen Street is very much a collaboration perspective. All of our portfolio investments are of different sizes, maturities, and we can actually very much share learnings and address common opportunities. A lot of these areas are very much in the nascent stages, such as climate strategies, DE&I. So the collaboration piece is actually really important, as well as thinking about the sort of guidance on metrics and reporting. And then within credit, we have less of a leading role. We operate via influence and engagement. We do collect metrics and data from them. And interestingly enough, a couple of years ago, if you'd sort of mentioned, ESG, you'd have often got a lot of blank stares. And now, we've got an open door. We don't even have to sort of, we don't have to do too much to extract information and data from them. They're actually hungry for us to help because of the experience we've had more often than not on our private equity side of the business. So, it's an interesting dynamic with both the strategies, but I think we don't have to force people to join us on the journey now.
Thanks, Alison. And the point you make there regarding collaboration and sharing of insight and knowledge, there's no perfect answer, but in your role, being able to look across a portfolio of corporates and investments, you have a key role, I guess, in bringing that information and that insight across that portfolio. Just picking up on that point, if I may, on the change you've observed over the last few years, the much greater engagement you're seeing now, and less requirement, if you like, to enforce or require the ESG integration into strategies. Would you make a couple of observations just about that in terms of if things aren't going well, what do you do if you feel that an investee company is off track or not properly recognizing these issues?
I mean, I think we haven't necessarily, and that's an interesting comment actually, because a couple of years ago we wouldn't necessarily have mandated it. Now we do mandate it, that they have to address things. So for example, we have to have policy adherence. If they don't have a certain policy, they have to, within a certain period after ownership, they have to do it. We've got targets and commitments in terms of climate strategies, and also DE&I as well. So we basically is sort of mandated as through the cycle of the investment.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful and kind of a useful message, I think, for the attendees to this call. Thanks very much. We'll come back to that. If I may, I might just turn now to Steve, if I could, Steve. Looking from your perspective, wearing your lender hat, I think primarily, I think one of the outputs from COP26 was the prominence of the lending and finance community, but particularly the banks, I suppose, in their role of ensuring that their borrower portfolio is properly transitioning. And you've certainly seen an uptick in engagement between lenders and the borrowers in this context. But it's difficult there often when you've got an existing portfolio, I suppose, as well. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you work with your existing portfolio and also what you expect of them now in terms of net zero targets and strategies.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, and good morning, Michael and everybody. Yeah, it's a great question. I think that pace has been phenomenal in terms of how quickly that engagement has started, but also the scale of the exercise that we need to undertake. In terms of where we've started on that, we've had to do some heat map analysis across our own portfolio for the purposes of the regulator, in order to sort of demonstrate where the pinch points are across all of the sectors within which we operate, and where each of those industries are in relation to the key risks associated with climate risk, and whether that's transition or physical. Now the next step is then how you actually apply that going forward and how that's going to influence the decisions that you make around financing. And I know we're going to come on and talk about that in due course. But what that naturally leads to is a much greater degree of engagement with our borrowers and our clients to understand what their transition strategies are and how they align with our own targets that we as an institution have set, which is to be net zero across what we finance by 2050. And of course, there's really only two levers within that. There's what we finance and what our borrowers actually achieve themselves in terms of their transition strategy. So if we don't know the second part of that and take time to understand that in greater detail, then it means that we impact and we make our own decisions around what we finance, and that's not the best way of achieving the most optimal outcome for the industry. So we have to look at it far more responsibly than that. And I think the other point I would just say is that I think our influence is probably less at this moment in time than, say, asset managers, because we've been a bit later to the party. Although our main influence is at the moment, prior to this very detailed consultation with our borrowers, is around financing frameworks and helping design financing frameworks that allow our clients to continue to finance their businesses. And also the other one, we get a lot of inquiries at the moment from borrowers around how do they improve their ESG ratings, noting that a lot of external companies who provide ESG ratings do so without fully disclosing the metrics that sit behind that, and often on a basis where if they can't find the information publicly available, then they might mark down in certain categories that has a negative impact. So a lot of borrowers coming to us at the moment and saying, can you do the work for us? We can't get these entities to engage with us. Help us improve our ESG rating. So that happens more and more at the moment as well.
Thanks, Steve. That's a really interesting. That last point actually is a really fascinating point about this kind of improvement of ESG ratings, and I guess the pressure GCs will be seeing that their boards are under, their chief executives under, to make these net zero statements and improve ESG ratings. And we find that in our business as well, where if you're unable to fill in a particular category of a questionnaire, for example, in terms of the rating, you get marked down. But actually, we'll come on to talk about this a bit more, but there's also a risk of over-promising as well, particularly when it hits the corporate level. I guess you're striking the right balance is critical there.
Yeah, the more promises that you make, the more you put yourself in the spotlight, and the more the importance of the accuracy of what you're saying, it comes to the fore, for sure. You know, the more you make those statements, if it's not backed up by what people can easily find, which often is those ESG rating scores, then obviously the two don't marry together very well. So yeah, it becomes incredibly important to understand how those scores are, how they come to.
Together, yeah, the data, and we'll come on as well to this point around alignment. You know, the corporate objectives of MUFG or corporate objectives of the bank, and making sure those are fed through and aligned with all of the borrowers and other touch points that the business has is a critical element. We'll maybe come back to that as we get into the question of measurement and data in particular. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and really interesting comment there about the kind of pace of change, which I know we're all seeing, and no one has been more in the middle of all of this than Richard. If I might turn to you now, Richard, and just get some introductory observations from your perspective at CPPI. I mean, you've got a huge range of public and private investments globally, a significant portfolio indeed, but often, I guess, in contrast to the comments Allison made, minority stakes. So I guess it'd be interesting to hear you know, your observations of what you've heard already in relation to points we just discussed with Steve, but also the question around the influence that you as a large investor can have, your engagement with the board, and also maybe a little bit around what you're seeing in terms of net zero commitments and other sustainability objectives from your investee businesses.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and good morning, everyone. Maybe just start with just a bit of background on CPP, because you alluded to us there in terms of the scope, but it's $540 billion of net assets, 26 investment programs, 85% invested in the equity tranche of the capital structure, public and private, 15% credit, and 20% in the sovereign debt. So the fund is actually levered. About 55% of the assets today are private. And notably is that we actually have a legislative mandate enshrined in something called the CPP-IB Act, that is that we have to maximize returns without undue risk of loss. So in many ways, you could position us as a fiduciary first investor. But despite that fiduciary orientation, we've had a sustainable investing program for over 15 years. Why? Well, because we firmly believe that issuers and investors who proactively identify and manage 21st century business risks and opportunities will deliver superior returns. So we believe that integration is fundamentally aligned with the fiduciary obligations placed on boards, but also the fiduciary obligations on investors. Now, with respect to climate, I occasionally have conversations with issuers where they expect me to prescribe to them what I expect to see them, and we never do that. I think the first thing I'd say is, if this were easy, we'd have fixed it already. And notable is the UNFCCC, which effectively is what catalyzed the Kyoto Protocol and everything since, was actually open for signatures 30 years ago. So governments of the world decided they wanted to combat climate 3 decades ago. And I think we can all acknowledge we've seen very little progress really until the last 7 years of that, really since the Paris Agreement was signed. Now, the reason I start there is that climate is creating a real tension for fiduciaries. It's novel, it's complex, it's like learning a foreign language, but a foreign language where we haven't yet decided on all the vocabulary and the grammar. And as a result, I think you're probably encountering in the audience, many people just want to make this go away. They'd love a quick fix, the silver bullet that kicks this down the road. The problem, however, is that the data and tools we need to comprehensively address climate risk are really not yet fit for purpose. I'd say at best, we might just have broken for tea on the first day of a 5-day test. So we have a lot more of this game to play before I think anyone is in a position to make representation they've firmly got their arms around the risks and the opportunities associated with climate. And I think that creates real legal risks for issuers and investors, not just with respect to their external communications on the subject, but also in what they're putting in place to demonstrate robust governance, policy process, the reporting, and the remediation action they take where they identify they have exposures they need to fix. And I think my position today would be that you simply can't make categorical representations about climate yet, as you can't possibly have done the work to substantiate those and don't have the tools to support that. Now, this is maybe going to sound like a bit of a pivot now, but with that said, we have just made our commitment to net zero. I think it's worth explaining why. And that is that the last few years have seen a real step change in sovereign ambition, and I'd say a transition from ambition to action. This is starting to translate into regulation. In turn, we've seen a large growth in the number of corporates committing to net zero, and an expansion across the globe in the scope of carbon markets. We are now seeing regulatory and economic incentives to abatement increasing, but also I'd say there's an evolving need to develop transition plans to preserve access to capital, as Steve alluded to, but also I'd say preserve access to suppliers and customers who have also committed to net zero. Now, we don't know how and we don't know when the global economy will decarbonize. And I say, given this evolving reality, though, we believe it's now our responsibility to integrate consideration of the transition into portfolio design, security selection, and importantly, our engagement with our portfolio companies. For those of you that haven't seen our commitment to net zero, one thing I would add, though, is that unlike many commitments to net zero that identify a sole variable of sovereigns delivering upon their commitments, we identify 5 distinct factors that we think are going to determine how and whether we get there. And that is consumer behavior, continued development of technology, the development of carbon markets, corporate delivery, and lastly, government ambition and regulation. So I think it's important consideration there. We spent a year agonizing over making this commitment and concluded if we make it, we need to make very clear what we're responsible for, and that is portfolio design, security selection, and engagement. But I think in essence, our position would now be this. Companies that can't transition, at least in line with their emerging industry pathways, will lose access to capital over the medium term, presenting an investment risk for their shareholders. You heard me earlier on, I don't like to talk about ESG. It sounds like a discrete discipline that resides at the end of the corridor. We prefer to have a conversation around helping our investment teams and our portfolio companies identify and manage 21st century business risks. We also seek to demonstrate very, very keen respect of the triad. There are discrete roles, responsibilities, and rights that accrue to owners, boards, and executives. And we never want to seek to encroach in the responsibilities of boards. I think we are seeing across the public markets at the moment, I'd say, some overreach. I think investors are frustrated that corporates haven't moved fast enough and are starting to seek to prescribe, but that's not our approach. We would rather be the invisible hand that maybe engages with corporates and compels them really through enlightened self-interest to do the right thing. So our expectations with respect to climate are very clear. We expect the board to demonstrate that it is providing oversight and counsel to the executive through the creation of a clear governance framework, the identification of risks and opportunities, the quantification of those, the integration of those insights into strategy, operations, and public disclosures. Now, effective the last AGM season, where we identify that that is not taking place and the issuer represents considerable climate risk in our portfolio, we will now withhold support for the reappointment of directors. Unfortunately, we've arrived at the conclusion if directors can't demonstrate this, we reasonably have to conclude that they are failing to discharge their fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of our portfolio company.
Thanks, Richard. A very insightful or actionable insight there, I guess. From if I'm thinking about the general counsel role, there is, the point you made just before the last point really was one about, apologies if my language is a bit clumsy about the use of ESG, but absolutely endorse the point you're making, and we're hearing from clients consistently, is that the governance challenge here is integrating these factors across the governance structure of the business and making sure it's fully integrated in the way you describe. And a real kind of insight there, I guess, for General Counsel in terms of how they organise their role, but also organise the governance structure of the business that they're responsible for. And yeah, your last comment there about the kind of levers available, obviously ultimately influencing the makeup of the board. Absolutely clear message there. Could you comment just a little bit more on the question of the kind of net zero commitment? I mean, it was just to go back to the one you were talking about, this your own CPPI's commitment, and I'm not sure it's right to use the word caveated, but certainly certain conditions attached to that I think were very important relative to some other commitments that one sees made without those caveats regarding government regulation, etc.
It's definitely a question we've had from some of our stakeholders. Are there 5 times as many caveats because you want 5 times as many get outs? No, I think we wanted to make very clear what we think we are responsible for, because the vast majority of our emissions fall into financed emissions, which for us are scope 3, but within there the scope 1, 2 and 3 of our portfolio companies. And really the only levers we have, and I think Stephen alluded to this, are the portfolio design, the security selection, and how we demonstrate our active ownership. Increasingly, I think we think of it as robust stewardship. I think there's definitely a need to lean in on some of these issues harder than we have done previously, but still respecting the triad. Why those 5? Because really, in part, those 5 variables are what will determine whether we attain net zero or not. I think it's very, very easy to say it's just about regulation, but it's not. We have 500 gigatons of budget left. A large share of that budget is a direct consequence of consumer consumption decisions. And if the consumer decides to be proactive in seeking to decarbonize its basket, that will alleviate a lot of pressure from corporates. Simultaneously, technology, you don't have to make very big changes in terms of the evolution of technology available to issuers to dramatically improve the cost of abatement for issuers, further alleviating the pressure that falls on the issuers themselves to pivot their businesses. The other consideration is carbon markets. We have a spread across the globe now. In Canada, currently $50 a ton, but proactively escalating up to $170 a ton. We have a European market that's around 70 euros a ton. We have different compliance markets in the US and China where prices are lower, but clearly all grinding higher. So I think we need to be open to the fact that the role that carbon markets, probably carbon markets over carbon taxation, has in providing an economic signal that fiduciaries can respond to in thinking about the deployment of capital to abatement. And then lastly, yes, there is the government role, but I think we've already observed, I don't know if you all saw on the first day of COP, a paper was published by the UK government, by the Nudge Unit, and it was immediately removed from the government's websites as it became clear that one of the challenges we have in decarbonisation is the need to consider policy that will seek to change consumer behavior. And I think a lot of the focus for government is how do we create a socially acceptable transition? We're already seeing in the UK, you don't need fuel bills to rise very much before all of a sudden the appetite for transition can change. So the reason we put them out is that they are fundamental inputs into determining how we get there. And the interplay between the 5 of them is not only going to shape how and when we get there, but when and where risks present themselves, and when and where opportunities present themselves that we, and I think our portfolio companies, need to seek to anticipate.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks, Richard. That's a very clear exposition of that point. I might just move on now to sort of extend the topic a bit more, looking at the second area I was mentioned at the beginning, the kind of availability and cost of finance. And I suppose the segue there is, we've highlighted very clearly the risks, if you like, regarding availability of finance and investment if one doesn't have a clear, credible plan, etc., and an integrated strategy. I was wondering, I might just kind of pivot a little bit and bring Alison and Stephen on this one initially, which is the question of, you know, what opportunities arise as a result of a clear and deliverable strategy that addresses these risks. I was thinking about that, you know, in the context of, I'll come to Steve in a minute, but on the context of sustainable finance and the sustainability linked finance and from the debt perspective. But Alison, I was wondering first, if I come to you, you know, as a investor focused on the transformation, are you finding, what would you say you're finding in relation to the availability of investors and the willingness to respond to, you know, properly and quality business that has a transformation at its heart?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of facets really from the investor appetite and universe as regards to sustainability and ESG. I mean, first off, you know, in a way, if you think about it, it's like a Venn diagram. You've got sustainability of operations and the business. So, you know, are you a good, ethically run business who cares about the environment, social factors, and has the highest levels of governance? And so if you think about the investor universe generally, that they often focus more on that aspect first. And then the other part is impact and transformation. So how can financial services actually help with a transition to a more environmentally friendly environment? You know, there's obviously a lot of appetite for an energy efficiency project, so financing the infrastructure to enable that to happen. Also helping consumers and businesses wade through the complexity of what they should be doing. So whether it's like energy efficient homes, electric vehicles, and all that involves not just the actual vehicles, but the infrastructure that supports that as well, and the technology. So in the middle is that sweet spot of the sustainability and the impact, and that's really, I think, what investors are sort of really looking for. And I think that's really where the future of sustainability linked finance will lie. It's not just in fact that, okay, well, we've got a commitment to net zero. Is actually what is a positive impact, sustainability impact that you can deliver. And that, I think, is where it's going to be, that's the future of sustainability linked finance.
Yeah, no, absolutely critical point there. The kind of centrality of impact for investors now is really growing exponentially. And we'll come on to a bit more of that, Alison, for me in a minute when we get on to kind of measurement and so on. But that's really helpful. Just Steve, you talked earlier about availability of finance, etc. Just thinking, you know, what could borrowers do to improve their attractiveness from a finance perspective, and also perhaps address these issues around cost? You know, could you make some observations, I guess, from the lending perspective of the growth of the sustainable linked finance market, and does it have a significant role to play in your view?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that the volume increases of sustainable linked loans and bonds, you know, speak volumes of, you know, in terms of the growth that we've seen in that market. At a regional level, of course, Europe leads the way, but the US is catching up fast, and I think that's the sort of the general trend that we see in financing terms across the board. I think you know, Richard touched on it earlier. If corporates are falling behind the trajectory of their sectors, then they're going to be the ones that find it harder to attract financing, and that it's not going to take very long for that to become very noticeable. You know, I think you know, again, to use you know, Richard's cricket analogy, I'm not, you know, it doesn't feel from my perspective that we've yet reached the tea interval. It feels as though you're still going out to bat, but whilst you are going out to bat, you're constantly having people handing you rules that they're writing on the way out to the wicket, and that's changing all the time. But you know, so we're still at the early stages of the sort of the design phase of how we factor transition into our financing decisions. But you can guarantee over the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to get a lot more sophisticated in how we do that. It's going to be tougher to reach, you know, to achieve our own benchmarks that we set. and that in turn is going to have an impact on the availability of finance in certain sectors. So, let's, as we sit here right now, if you're a pure upstream company in the oil and gas sector versus an integrated company that is transitioning its business and investing in certain parts of the energy transition, of course, it's going to be harder to compete for finance at the same price. I mean, it's already priced into the financing for certain sectors, and you're going to see that divergence really increase in short order. And then, as banks get a much clearer understanding of transition risk and what that means, and the risks associated with that, and also it becomes a bit of a vicious circle. If banks come to the conclusion that it will become harder for corporates to achieve finance, then that will impact your view of their risk, and you'll factor that into your own rating methodology. And the natural consequence of that is that it will have an impact on the price of finance, because it will be harder for you to hit your return hurdles. So it does become a very a vicious circle in that regard.
Yeah, I see that absolutely, and another really useful insight from for the audience there. In relation to that, I was going to if I might just sort of continue on a little bit, and then I'll come to Richard after. Just stay with you for a minute, Steve, on the question of the kind of harder to abate sectors. I think you've sort of touched on it, but the kind of thing I jotted down to ask was really, how do harder to abate sectors? And you mentioned one of them. How do they address this issue? Is it simply through this industry benchmarking approach that you and Richard have talked about? If you're in the transition and you're in the pack, you're okay. Any other observations you would make around that in terms of those sectors? I've been often said that this is part of the solution, not part of the problem at the end of the day.
I think you have to strive to be at the forefront of your industry in terms of opening up your book and demonstrating how the actual tangible actions that you're taking that are making a difference in relation to transition. Those that do that will be the ones that continue to find it easier to finance their business going forward. Having targets, linking them to their financing strategies, and building them into their corporate financing arrangements is a good way of doing that. I'm sure we'll come on to it in terms of that you have to take real care when you're doing that to make sure you can stand behind that and back that up. But those are the ones that are at the forefront. And I think I'm seeing some industries that are I would say really recognizing that they're coming into the crosshairs and actually trying to get ahead of the game. The aviation industry, I would say, is one of those. Notwithstanding everything, the pressures that have been placed on that industry over the last couple of years, in particular, that has not delayed the pace of change in interest in recognizing that they need to make some serious changes if they're going to survive in the long term. So I think that's a good indicator for me of an industry that is recognizing that and is making some advanced steps. But we break down all of our portfolio across 27 different industries, and each and every one of them needs to shine the light on themselves in the same way.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Yeah, and getting ahead of the game, both as an industry and as a corporate, is certainly a good piece of advice. Thanks, Steve. I might just come to Richard next, just maybe follow on that topic on the kind of harder to abate sectors, and maybe just, Richard, if you're able to offer some more observations around that topic. And the sort of third topic I was going to touch on, which we've kind of covered a bit, I don't need to dwell on too much, is like, what does a good transition plan look like is the high level points. We've talked a lot about targets and the corporates having suitable targets, but obviously underpinning that is the delivery. We talked about taking the hard to abate sectors, for example, there's obviously a bigger challenge there to have credible and deliverable plans. But I was wondering, Richard, if you're able to offer some observations on what a good transition plan might look like from your perspective, and any further thoughts and observations on that hard to abate point as well would be very useful. Thanks.
Very quickly on hard to abate, we have a private credit program. We continue to lend to harder to abate sectors. We're very much of the view, though, that if we're doing that, we should be seeking to create incentives for those businesses to decarbonize. And a few of the loans we put in place recently effectively said we are willing to extend you credit inside the market, but there are hooks attached to that. And that is that you need to set up a climate governance framework, quantify baseline greenhouse gas emissions, address fugitive methane release straight away, then subsequently reduce scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and over the medium term deliver effectively a medium term lens on scope 3. Failure to deliver on any of those will result in an adverse ratchet to the rate. So it's not easy, particularly in competitive markets where people are trying to lend capital, to be able to get everyone to sign up to some of those covenants. But I think those covenants are intellectually aligned with the underlying credit risk associated with businesses that don't do these things. It might be okay today for a few minutes longer not to have those things in flight, but if when that comes to refinancing that facility in 3 or 5 years' time, if those things are not done, I think the risk around refinancing will be considerable. So creating an economic incentive for the borrower to do the right thing, I think, is one lever that capital markets participants have to do that. In terms of transition plans, look, very quickly, there is no boardroom on earth that is not faced today with this reality. The fan of outcomes on consumer behavior is wide. The fan of outcomes on regulation is wide. The fan of outcomes on technology is wide. Okay, the fan of outcome on carbon prices is wide. Okay, the notion that anybody can articulate a transition plan to 2050 today that will not need to be subject to considerable revision between now and 2050 is preposterous. Okay, so my first advice would be to issuers: stop making light of this. It's not that easy. Okay, if it were, we'd be done already. So I think the first thing is actually embrace, the intellectual reality of what we confront here, and that is some of our abatement potential is economic now. And that is through efficiency measures, through greening of power supplies, and through investments that even under today's operating environment are economic. Okay. Let's actually get those in short-term plans, because the question there should not be, if, it should be when we can deliver on that decarbonisation. There is then some uncertainty to contemplate. Now, I struggle with the interplay of those 4 variables I touched on. It's too complex. What we proposed at the start of COP was a process called an abatement capacity assessment, where once the proven capacity has been quantified, corporates then should recalculate what would become economic to abate at $75 a tonne and $150 a tonne, and position that as long-term probable abatement capacity, and have that conversation with the board. What are the technologies? What are the specific reductions in break-even costs that we need to make this economic to do? How actively are we diligencing this, and what visibility do we want to provide to the market that will be possible? The residual is that bit that we can't abate even at $150. And I think companies need to be more pragmatic and more honest in what they plan to do with those really hard to abate processes. Do they plan to run them off? Do they plan to offset them? Or do they hold out residual hope that technology will become available that allows them to abate those emissions? And the reason I frame it that way is I am really genuinely concerned today that we now have 5,000 issuers have indicated that they will be net zero by 2050. If they don't deliver upon that guidance that they've given to the market, I really, really worry that we will see accusation of market abuse and securities fraud. And I find it quite interesting that forward-looking guidance are typically subject to very, very heightened scrutiny in terms of corporate comms, the board, and council. There is greater scrutiny today on the forward guidance for next year's pre-tax earnings than there seems to be for the forward guidance of the decarbonisation in the business 3 decades from now. And I think we have to see a recalibration of that over the next 12 months. It feels like we've got the hangover after the COP26 party at the moment. We all got very excited and we all committed to a lot of things, but I think the next 12 and 24 months will be actually working through the reality of what we've committed to and how we can actually substantiate these claims responsibly and mitigate risk to the issuer as we do.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, the fascinating couple of points in there that really draw out. One is the kind of long-term claims, and perhaps COP encouraged that kind of ambitious statement of long-term ambitions and net zero commitments. But actually, in addition to kind of moderating that approach, having regard to the art of the possible, the critical thing is the short-term actions that can be taken now, and not to lose sight of those. And certainly something we constantly have dialogue with clients on this point is the need for these interim targets and interim plans, one step at a time. Just because the scale of the problem seems large, don't start climbing the mountain, so to speak, to mix metaphors there. But yeah, no, there's some really useful insights there, and indeed a significant risk emerging, as I think we all observe, if we don't address these issues. Thanks, Richard. That was really insightful. Just a quick to the audience as well, if you've got any questions, just a reminder to use the Q&A function on your screen, bottom of your screen, to type questions in, and we'll put them to the panel, or we'll try and answer those. I think we've kind of covered quite well there transition plans. I'd sort of jotted down what does a good transition plan look like. I think Richard, Stephen, Nelson, you've kind of touched on that a reasonable amount. I did write down the question, does good exist, as well, but I think we've maybe answered that as well. But maybe we might just move on to the fourth topic, I think, which is the question of data and measurement. And one thing that really struck me on all of this was looking at a study done a couple of years ago, I think it was now. It looked at the credit rating agencies and how they operate, and noted that corporates who avail themselves of credit rating agency support, they provide certain data to the agencies and they provide certain outputs. And generally, between the different agencies, there's a 0.99 correlation, almost 100% correlation in terms of what the outputs are, i.e. the guidance is consistent, reliable, and clear to the market, largely. We could debate that on a different topic. But when one looks at ESG sustainability measures, firstly, the availability of data is patchy. You feed it into one of the different measurement systems available, and the correlation levels drop to about 0.6, i.e. really quite wildly off. So there's kind of a couple of points in there. The need for reliable data. Can you get it as an investor? Do you have the rights and obligations on the part of your investee or borrowers to give you that data? If you do get it, how reliable is it, and how does one address that? And then there's obviously the development of the International Sustainability Standards Boards and other global standardization agenda. The pace of change there, I'm wondering if that's quick enough. I wonder on the first topic, I might just keep the same order if I may, and turn to Alison first. You obviously have a stronger contractual relationships, at least with your investee companies, and just wondered if you had some observations on the first point, really, around the availability of data and the quality of it, and what solutions or initiatives you're seeing that might address the disparity of outcomes that I've described earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all aware of the dark arts of ESG data. I mean, it's interesting because, we operate largely within the private universe, where actually the ESG ratings agencies, we can't use them because basically they don't report on. So we have to effectively start from scratch in a way. So we have to make sure that we go to our investments, whether they're in the credit sphere or the private equity sphere, and with a comprehensive data set, and effectively we do it ourselves. We effectively do our own ranking and rating and indices based off, what we think is right now and looking to the future. Basically we are starting to see some harmonization, and hopefully the ISSB will help. But also, lenders and investors will get ever more sophisticated in evaluating and backing up the targets and associated metrics with more automation on the horizon. And I can sort of see the blockchain coming into play as well. And it's that sort of the backing up the targets and the metrics, which is ever more important. I think, at the moment, there is no mandated assurance on ESG data, but I can see that coming down the road. And so it's sort of, I think that's sort of my advice to companies, whatever size you are, is start collecting now. Whether or not a regulation applies to you now or in the future, it doesn't really matter, because the investors will be expecting you to be looking at this data and adhering to certain regulations, whatever. You know, same thing with TCFD. It doesn't matter whether you're a large listed company or a small listed, or even a private company. You should be addressing it now and with a sort of a phased plan. So as you would address any other risk, you know, TCFD shouldn't be necessarily sort of seen on the side. It's just one of your corporate risks and address it in the same way. Yeah, obviously you need to start with what's mandatory. You know, I think carbon disclosures will become mandatory. So start with that. So I think the other area that will become mandatory is sort of the diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, that's the thing. You know, there's been a lot of focus on the environmental metrics. You know, but actually within sort of Collins Street's portfolio, they're not necessarily so material from a risk perspective. We don't operate in the sort of the asset heavy sphere. Mostly it's to do with people. So actually the people piece get ahead of the social pieces as well, because that is coming down the horizon. So, you know, don't just focus on the environmental piece. That's another piece of advice. And then really the other thing is making sure that, you know, whatever size you are, create a central data set and repository. Treat your data as another corporate data set, and apply analytics and, you know, your normal sort of like analytics and insights to your ESG data or sustainability data as you would on any other financial data, because ultimately it will become one data set that is scrutinized in the same way.
Thanks, Alison. A really good point about, you know, collecting data now, and then, you know, the standardization will follow. I think that's you can never, and there's a big agenda around sort of transparency around that. I think, you know, there's a kind of really interesting observation I've heard made about, you know, data is proprietary to businesses, but equally with the increased transparency there is regarding ESG performance, you know, the external market will often know more about your business than you do as well at some point. So I think having that data internally to back it up is a key point as well. And thanks very much indeed. Really good point. And Steve, I mean, you've kind of touched on it, I think, but, you know, does my comment about the rating agencies ring true? You know, I mean, obviously banks and lenders super reliant on this kind of standardized approach, and do you have any observations about, you know, the timing of a standardized approach from an ESG carbon or broader ESG agenda?
I mean, your comments do ring true, which is, you know, probably goes to some extent to the point that Alison was making, which is why, you know, finance parties like ourselves are coming up with our own methodologies for measurement. But they only work if you can then you've got the data that you can back them up, and that data is auditable, and you know, as we you know, as we disclose more and more, that's going to come under more and more scrutiny, and needs to be justified. And I think, you know, from my perspective, I think what then becomes very interesting is from a governance perspective. You know, that is how management teams are going to be held accountable. You know, do the business decisions that they have made link to the data that they hold upon their portfolios? And if they don't, then they're going to have to justify why they've made certain business decisions. And you know, this is you know, the increase in data in this regard is going to give a lot more insight for you know, for shareholders to ask questions of their companies as to why they've made certain business decisions. So I think you know, again, we're sort of at the beginning of that process, but and it is a shame that there isn't more standardization, but at the same time, when we're looking at sort of how we're going to achieve our own targets that we've set, we've got, you know, we're looking very, very closely at our peers and what they're doing, and what best practices we can take and bring into our own analysis, and I'm sure everybody else will be doing the same. So as a degree of that, you know, you will get a degree of standardization through that approach.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks. And just as one observation, in my role as a banking lawyer, I suppose you're kind of aware of the contractual rights the lenders have to get information from borrowers, and this can be challenging, I think, in the context of ESG. I mean, even though they're quite often wide information obligations, they weren't really ever tailored in some of the historic documents for ESG related data. Any observations around maybe for borrowers as to how to engage with that? I mean, it obviously costs a lot to produce some of this information.
I think that's right, Michael, but I think, what we've already touched on thus far this morning is that, we're changing the behaviours of our borrowers by, what information we ask for outside of the legal agreements that we have in place, because of the way that then impacts our investment decisions, regardless of what goes into the legal documents. And there is a realisation from borrowers that they can't just say, no, we don't have that information, or we're not going to provide it, because there's a recognition that means they're going to start falling down the priority queue in terms of their access to capital. So, so I would agree with you. It's not always baked in, but I'm not seeing that as a big obstacle to actually getting a lot of that information at the moment.
Yeah, no, it's enlightened. We should be producing that information anyway. Yeah, no, really helpful. Thanks, Steve. I'm just sort of conscious of time, and we've only got a few minutes left. So what I was going to propose that we did was just kind of draw to sort of final observations, but I'll change the order a bit. I'll come to Richard next, just to sort of, and then come back round to Steve and Alison. And really, I suppose we started the conversation here making an observation is, can we offer some actionable insights for GCs and lawyers working in their businesses as to what they could or should do in relation to engagement with lenders and investors in the context of net zero and ESG. So that was a kind of objective, and I think I've tried to draw out the various insights that came through as we've been having these conversations. But I thought I might close by asking each of you in turn, just for one observation as to, what would you recommend to a GC these days, having regard to the future challenges that the business faces? What would be your one recommendation that a GC should do, when they hang up from this webinar? What should they go and do next in the context of engaging with their board and stakeholders? And I'll start with Richard, if I may, come to Steve next, then Alison, just to draw to a close.
Yeah, maybe I'd say we always hear about transition risk and physical risk. What we talk less about is litigation risk, and it's a real issue. I don't think we've necessarily fully seen the rubber hit the road on this yet, but I think there's a bunch of reasons why the litigation risk as it pertains to climate change means that the General Counsel or their team need to be in the strategic discussions that are taking place about how the company will pivot over the long term. We were just talking there about standards. Look, the TCFD is going to be regulated in most markets, is my expectations. Disclaimer, I'm a member of the task force, so I kind of sit at the table. But from what I said earlier on, you'll all be aware that misalignment with TCFD reporting means we will conclude your board is derelict in its duty to our company. So there is an element there between market impetus, but potentially also regulatory evolution. But the biggest thing for me here is that we have to embrace the degree of uncertainty there is. We need to be very careful about the categorical representations we make. And I think it's probably only the lawyers in the room that will be able to hold up the mirror to boards and executives and say, whilst we want some of these issues to go away, we need to ensure, as we articulate our vision for the medium term, we don't create unintended considerable risks to the company by virtue of being overzealous in virtue signaling.
Thanks, Richard. Very, very clear. A traditional role for a GC, but slightly different in the context of the kind of future-looking role there, bringing in a range of other experts and expertise. That's a very, very good point. Thanks, Richard. I'll turn to Steve next. Going back along the line for me.
Yeah, and very quickly, I think just sort of leading on from that, I would say, think of the function as more of an audit function, and I think we or certainly align with very well with audit functions on this topic. I recall my boss, a couple of Christmases ago, getting a Secret Santa present, which was a button that when you pressed it, kind of came out with a whole load of expletives that was quite useful in an office context. And I think we need to have somebody with that button to be used very regularly and call out statements that can't be substantiated at this moment in time. So I think we all need targets. We need the data to back up how we're going to get there, but we need to be very, very careful about the statements we're making here and now, and calling out if they can't be substantiated.
Yeah, the sort of critical questioning role, always a very important one for lawyers. Thanks, Steve. And finally, Alison.
I think for a GC, I think don't necessarily lead with the regulations and the technical stuff. That will follow. Actually think about what are you looking to achieve? How do you become a good, sustainable business? And what is a practical framework that can get you there? If you lead with the regulation and compliance, you might lose people. And it's so important you bring the boards, your executive committee, and your whole workforce along with you with this practical framework, which going back to what Richard and Stephen have been saying, an iterative framework. The regulations and technical stuff will follow.
100%, Alison. Well, thank you very much. And yeah, for me, I think the summary would be this point about, ask yourself, what should the company do, not just what can it do? And that final point about regulation, I couldn't agree more. Regulators will catch up, but it might be too late by the time they catch up for the sustainability, lowercase s sustainability of one's business. So yeah, absolutely. But a great opportunity and responsibility for lawyers, I think. So falls to me just to say, to close this session. So firstly, thank you very much indeed to Legal 500 for co-hosting this with us. Thank you to all of you for attending, and I hope you did get some actionable insights which you can take away. You can use the rest of your day, maybe perhaps go back to your desks. So thank you to all the attendees, and most importantly, thank you to Alison, Stephen, and Richard for joining me on the panel. Really enjoyed the discussion. Thought there was a lot of agreement, a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunity, I think, if we take one step at a time here, having regard to the volatile and uncertain world we're all living in at the moment, and will do for the future. So thank you very much indeed to all of the panelists. Final point for me as well is if you'd like to attend future GC sustainability fora, please tick the box on your screen and in the pop-up. But otherwise, thank you very much indeed, and have a good rest of the day wherever you are. Thank you.